I can remember as early as grade school engaging in heated debates and getting worked up when another kid said something that I took exception to. Now, oftentimes, this would lead to my mother, who, thanks to me, was on a first name basis with my principals and my teacher, getting another call from the school. It happened, unfortunately, all too often. And those calls would inevitably lead to me getting a stern talking to. And after having delivered enough of those talks, my mother's script was somewhat predictable. It always ended the same way. It ended with her saying something to me that, while well intentioned, was really untrue. She would say to me, "Now, son, how many times have I told you?" And I would interject and I'd say, I know. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." And she'd say, "That's right, son. So you just ignore those other kids and you'll be fine." And I think we all know that the world would be a much better place if my mother had been right. But she wasn't. She wasn't. And that's why we're here today. That's why we're having these kinds of conversations. Now, in my mother's defense, I'm a parent now. I have two little girls, and I get the need to occasionally shade the facts a little bit in order to motivate your kids to do the things they need to do. My youngest daughter is, she eats all of her vegetables because she's convinced that if she doesn't, she'll grow a beard. And she doesn't want to be the only little girl at school with a beard. So I get that you have to do that sometimes, but at least in this case, we understand that information is a very serious thing and it does have consequences. I want to thank Kathy again for a kind introduction. As she said, I'm a GMU alum, very proud to be part of the George Mason University family, and very proud of the work that this university does. Now, I know I hit the jackpot here with the post-lunch slot. I know tummies are full, and if I go on too long, I'm going to start to sound like one of the parents from a Peanuts cartoon, so I don't want to do that. But what I do want to talk about this afternoon, largely from the perspective of a practitioner. And to be clear, that's what I am. I'm a practitioner. I listened a little bit this morning, and you had a lot of great experts talking about populism and the issue of character assassination. But what I'm going to do this today is I'm going to talk about this from someone who has had the opportunity to be in the field and to help organizations manage their reputations, and talk about some successes and some failures. And I look forward to answering some of your questions about that. I want to start with a point that I hope that the researchers in this room as well will appreciate, and that I hope that the practitioners in this room will agree with. As I said, I've had the opportunity to have some pretty interesting positions, and as I talk to other practitioners at various places in their career, the question inevitably comes up of, what do you do to position yourself to get to some of those positions? And I think it's important to point out that I always tell them that as a practitioner, I don't think I've ever done anything any different than any other practitioner has done, with one exception. And that one exception is that I follow the research. I read the research, I study the research. Communication research is the bread and butter for what I do as a practitioner. 25 years ago, when I started in this business, the idea of paying attention to what was coming out of the academy wasn't something that researchers did very much. And I think it was largely because our audiences and the information environment that we operated in was somewhat predictable. And I think as we get into the discussion a little bit, we all understand why. Today, practitioners understand that the information environment is exceedingly dynamic, that there are major shifts in the way that we consume, process, and share information. And what that means is that a communication strategy that was effective just a couple of years ago, it might fall flat today. And it's happened to every communication practitioner. As a result, there's this growing understanding among the practice community that to be successful, you have to keep your finger on the pulse of research, because it's the research that will help us understand how to cut through the noise and reach our audiences. So I just want to say again, the work done by CARP and the broader research community is extremely important in helping us understand this issue of character assassination and reputational politics. And it's helpful helping us fully understand the dimensions of this trend. I think this is really important because in an environment where anyone can be a dealer, a supplier, a user, or a victim of fabricated and deliberately harmful information, this is extremely important work. Let me spend a minute talking about information, because when we talk about character assassination, that's what we're really talking about. We're really talking about the malign use of information. It's as I indicated, it's often fabricated, but increasingly we're talking about information that is partially factual and partially fabricated. And I'm going to talk about an example from the last couple of days that just is still kind of got me back on my heels. Of course, the goal of that information is to destroy the credibility and reputation of a person, organization, or a group. But increasingly, disinformation and reputational attacks are used to influence the masses and reshape national identities. The practice of using information, both factual and manufactured, to attack, influence, or disparage is nothing new. I teach a course on national security communication. When I talk to my students about the use of information, I remind them that we have what we call instruments of national power. We even have a nifty acronym to help us remember what they are. It's DIME, D-I-M-E, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. So I ask my students, when you think about the use of information by a nation state, you think about the exercise of these national powers, who owns the D in DIME? Who owns diplomatic? And students, they'll think about it for a second, and these are national security students, so they'll say, Department of State. State Department is responsible for our diplomacy. And then I'll ask them, who owns the M? Who owns military? The exercise of military as an instrument of national power? Department of Defense. And what about economic? Who's responsible for leveraging our economic power as an instrument of national power? Inevitably, they say the Treasury Department. But when I ask them, tell me the agency or group or entity that's formally responsible for using information as an instrument of national power. And it's always the same. There's a bit of silence, and then inevitably someone will say, well, it's everyone. But just about the same time, someone will say, it's no one. And I think that really kind of helps us understand that we are far behind when it comes to understanding what's happening in the character assassination and reputational politics space when it comes to the use of information. If it is the case that our governments believe that it's important enough to be viewed as, that information is important enough to be viewed as an instrument of national power, then I would argue that it's probably important enough to have some formality. The interesting thing is that well, it's clear that individuals and groups seeking to inflict reputational harm on others have figured out that they don't need a lot of power or strategy to be successful. All they need is an incredibly salacious claim and one of those supercomputers that we carry around in our pockets. That's all you really need in order to engage in information warfare. That's all you really need to attack someone's character or to destroy someone's reputation. We see examples of this on an almost daily basis. I was just reading last night about an example that is still unfolding today. Congresswoman Ilan Omar she sent out a tweet and did an interview with CNN, wherein she talked about Senator Lindsey Graham. In her tweet, speaking about the senator, she said that she was talking about how the senator went from being one of the president's detractors to being one of his greatest supporters. And she said, speaking about Russia, she said, they got him. He's compromised. She went on to say that when she was asked about that interview on CNN, she said, we've seen many times where Senator Lindsey Graham has told us how dangerous this president could be if he was given the opportunity to be in the White House. She went on to say that she was pretty sure that there's something happening with him, whether it's something that has to do with funding for his campaign or running for office, or whether it has something to do with the pull that he might have in his district. She went on to say that he is somehow compromised and no longer able to stand up for the truth. Now, those were her words. She said those things. I have no idea if Representative Omar has any basis for that or if she was correct, but she did say those things. And I think that if she doesn't have any basis for it, those things are probably pretty irresponsible. But it didn't end there. And this is where I think it got interesting. The Congresswoman is facing a small firestorm of criticism today over what she said. Shortly after she said that, and let me tell you why I raise this. I raise this because I sent this tweet and the clip to some friends of mine this morning, about 6 friends, and I said, look, all I want you to do, first of all, I made sure that they had not seen this controversy. I said, all I want you to do is I want you to look at what she tweeted, and I want you to listen to what she said. And I want you to tell me what you hear. And to a person, all 6 of them came back and they said, well, she's criticizing. She thinks he's compromised. I don't know what he's compromised about, but she's criticizing him for being compromised. Okay, got it. After I told them what the criticism of Congressman Omar was and why she was being criticized, 2 of the 6 said, oh yeah, I totally see that. And the other 4 said, no, I don't see it at all. And the reason I raise this is because the 2 of the 6 who said, oh yeah, I see that, when we think about how disinformation and how character assassination works, if I have a message that's agenda driven and I send it out to all of you, and I can get just 5% of you to bite and to share that information and to amplify that information and to keep pushing that information, that's it. That's all that matters. I just need 5% of you. And so I kind of had that experience this morning with the people I talked with. So after the CNN interview, Tom Elliott from Arabian News, he tweeted that Omar had said that most Americans agree with her. Most Americans agree with her that Graham had been compromised and was being blackmailed over his homosexuality. That was the tweet. Now, really interesting that he actually posted the video that confirmed, without a shadow of a doubt, that she did not say that. But that was the tweet. Shortly after he sent that tweet, S.C. Cupp at CNN, someone who works where I work, she sent a tweet saying, "This is ignorant, homophobic, and unacceptable." Someone else tweeted, "Here we have Ilan Omar, a sitting congresswoman, floating around a conspiracy theory with absolutely zero evidence that Lindsey Graham is secretly gay and the GOP is holding him hostage. Unbelievable." Now, to be clear, she never said anything at all about his homosexuality. I shouldn't say his homosexuality, about the possibility that he's a homosexual. Never said anything at all about it. But you can see how just those 2 tweets now have resulted in more than 6,000 tweets that directly say that she said that he was homosexual and that he has been compromised. More than 6,000 tweets as of this morning before I came here. And many of those tweets have the video, they have the transcript right there with them. So I think just a great example of how this happens on a personal level. So there's a lot going on in that scenario. But the point is that we know what it looks like when the target of reputational attacks is an individual or an organization. But what about large-scale reputational attacks and the malign use of fabricated and misleading information? What happens when the same destructive strategies used for targeted assassination, for targeted character assassination, grow to become something of a movement? According to Google statistics, between January of 2017 and June of 2018, there was a 5-fold increase in people searching for the term populism. Webster's defines populism defines the term as a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded and dismissed by an established group. Now, I'll say something about that definition, because I think that in the context of this political environment, that definition fails to capture the true nature of the current populist movement and the sentiment of those driving it. We all understand that this is a movement that reflects a deep suspicion of the establishment and is generally of the belief that the establishment not only fails to represent the people, but fails to engage in activities that would be for the common good of the masses. It conspires against people, and these populists tend to believe that nativists they tend to be nativist and suspicious of foreigners. They're skeptical of facts if those facts are provided to them by the establishment press. But we all know that populism is nothing new. So it leaves us with this kind of fundamental question of why we're seeing a rise in populist ideology. Experts who study populism tend to look at traditional precursors and indicators, like economics, immigration, perceptions of government and regulation, and I think it's entirely appropriate to look at traditional causal factors. There is, however, a growing school of thought and opinion linking the increase in populism around the world to the growth of social networks. I mentioned earlier the ever-changing environment, and I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone here that part of what I'm referring to is our ability to be digitally connected on a continuous basis and to engage in the routine and continuous transfer of information. As I said, of course, the biggest part of that is social media. But to be clear, technology allows us to be connected in a growing number of ways. And there are reams of research pointing to how online communities influence our personal and social engagements, our civility in the digital space, our ideology, and even our behavior in the physical world. People, organizations, and even computer algorithms today can create content that's injected into the public discourse, captured by others, and spread like a virus. It is also the case that when we see this happen, we have a front row seat to the takedown of corporations, crushing of reputations, the toppling of political figures, and most important, I think, is that we have a front row seat to the reshaping of the ways that we view our communities and our place in society. Prior to the advent of social media, public political dialogue was confined to traditional media, print, radio, and television. Use of those mediums was limited by legislation and the requirement for a large initial and continuing capital investment. A small number of individuals or organizations were controlling the messaging and the resulting dialogue. That's where we were. That's where we were just 25 years ago. Of course, people had their own views. They had their own opinions. They voiced in the media, but their ability to communicate with and provide support to others in the same way or with the same ideology was limited. The internet, and specifically the proliferation of social media, fundamentally altered this paradigm. It ushered in an era in which anyone from anywhere in the world can, and this is key, anonymously create, share, and amplify content. And it's not like throwing the discourse into the middle of a crowded room of random people and yelling, "Discuss." Every one of us can tailor and direct our communication to ensure that it's being seen by the citizens that we are targeting or the particular group that we're targeting. So why does this matter in the context of the spread of populism? According to the Pew Research Center, social media has become a primary method of political and civic engagement for most Americans. In 2017, 60% of American adults used social networks like Facebook, Twitter, and others to engage in political activities. Now, I think that's an important statistic when we think about it in the context of the spread of populism. And it matters because in some cases, these engagements led to scenarios where individuals and groups easily find others who hold similar views or opinions. They limit their information to those sources, and they refuse to have their beliefs challenged, regardless of the validity of the evidence used to support those views. The result is that we have a fragmented and mutually supportive micro community that is isolated within its own small sphere. When I started, I talked a little bit about what happened in New Zealand, and some of my colleagues have been collecting information with regard to everything that was available to the public and to law enforcement regarding this particular individual and the groups that he associated with prior to the attack in New Zealand. I was mentioning to Professor Rowan that one of the really interesting things about this community is that when we go, two things. When we go back and look at the people that he was in communication with, we find that this community was so tight-knit and it was so isolated. And the kind of language that if I stood here and said just some of the things, you would all be terribly offended, that language was the norm within this group. What was really interesting about that is that after the video was posted and after the manifesto was posted, there's this rush on the part of practitioners and researchers to collect all of the dialogue in relation to that video and that manifesto. That dialogue reaches a whole new level in terms of how offensive it is. I mean, there were people who were calling this individual, a god, blessed. Some people who were admiring him in ways that were encouraging others to follow suit. Here's an example of who we should be. Here's an example of what we must do. This is the way that we take back our country, our position in the world. So that's what we saw afterwards. Now, I was saying something that I think, I often say this on air and it causes a lot of debate. When you think about that, whether that happens here in the United States, whether that happens in New Zealand and other places, It raises a really interesting question with regard to how we deal with this issue. If you were asking me where I might look for the next person, the next group of people who might be triggered to do something like this, you might naturally say, well, the people who had very positive things to say about what this individual did might be a good place to start. They clearly share an ideology. But the reason people bristle when I say that is because the idea that we might look at people who support a particular movement or particular ideology as offensive or abhorrent as that ideology is, the idea that we would look at those people and we would say, these are the people that we need to watch, these are the people that we need to have concerns with, is something that challenges our ideas of free speech and kind of freedom to live and think and do as we please. And I would just say that it's something I've said many times over the past several years. One of the things that we have to do in this country with regard to these kinds of things is we have to take a step back and ask ourselves what the right balance is between our privacy rights and our desire to be secure. One of the things that we know today with regard to the Tsarnaev brothers and the Boston bombing is that if we had violated the privacy and civil liberty rights of the Tsarnaev brothers, then we would have been able to easily prevent the Boston bombing. We would have been able to do that because when we went and looked at the communication after the fact, we were able to clearly see what was being planned, what was going to happen. Now, there are people who hear that and say, it doesn't matter. It would have been wrong to violate their civil liberty and privacy rights and to look at their communication, to investigate them when there was no cause to do so. And others who say, that's terrible. We can't live in a society where we only know what's being planned in terms of these horrible attacks after the fact. We have to change the way that we think about this. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I think this is one of the great things about living in this country is that as a society, we get to decide these things. We get to make decisions about where the right balance is. But I do think just with regard to this issue of New Zealand, it does bring this question to the fore again. One of the things I wanted to touch on today was, the idea that some colleagues in mine currently have an article that we have under review that kind of addresses this issue of what we should do with regard to not only disinformation, character assassination, reputational politics, but how we should look at this as a nation, how we should look at this as a government and as individuals. One of the challenges we have right now is if you look at the legislation that's out there that deals exclusively with information, there are about 11 bills that are just sitting out there that haven't moved that deal with the issue of disinformation, the idea that there are people out there who create information and inject it into the information space, and they do that with the idea that they're going to achieve a particular objective. Those bills are just sitting out there, and if you look at all of those bills, there's one thing that's common to all of them. They all take the approach of attacking the problem of character assassination or reputational politics or disinformation at a particular place in the life cycle of disinformation. And so some colleagues of mine, we took a step back and talked to some members of Congress with the idea toward helping them understand that disinformation, character assassination, reputation politics all exist in a life cycle. They exist kind of on a continuum. There's a process here. So we've developed what we call the Disinformation Lifecycle Framework. And I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit about the idea here, and then we can talk a little bit more about some of these more relevant issues. The Disinformation Lifecycle Framework approaches the issue of disinformation and character assassination from the perspective that there is a start where someone out there right now, one of you guys are thinking, you know what, this guy Turner, as soon as he leaves, I'm going to tweet something about him and it's really going to ruin his life. That's the start, right? That's where the concept, the idea where someone says, I'm going to engage in a disinformation campaign or I'm going to do something to attack someone's reputation. In the Disinformation Lifecycle Framework, that's way down here. That's the first balloon. And that's the place where we need to first try to pop the bubble. Okay, so let's assume that we fail to pop the bubble at that first point. And then that person or that nation state or that group moves on to the second point where they actually develop the disinformation campaign. They develop the messages, they develop the strategy, the idea, the people who actually are going to be responsible for putting it into the channel. That's the second point at which, as a government, as organizations, we can seek to pop the bubble. Now, understanding that we have to be able to see this process happening, and I'll address that in a second. So you get to the point, let's assume that we fail to pop the button at that second point in the disinformation life cycle. Now you get to the point where the information is in our communication channels. It's in social media. It's being passed around in the digital space. It may be on television, radio. The disinformation is actually out there. That's the next point at which you can pop that bubble and try to deal with it. Now, right now, there's legislation that would seek to pop the bubble there through regulation. There's pressure on the tech companies that would seek to pop the bubble at that point. That's the third point in the disinformation life cycle framework. You get to the last point in the disinformation life cycle, and that's the hardest point. That's when the information actually gets to you and me, and it gets inside our minds, and it gets inside our heads, and it begins to change our attitudes and our worldviews. It begins to change our behavior when we think about how we relate to the people in our community, or we think about what we're going to do when we go to the ballot box. That's where it it's really difficult. So the last question is, how do we pop that bubble when it gets to the point where that information is actually affecting us? The disinformation lifecycle framework is an idea where we would, at least from a government perspective, and this harkens back to my point that no one in government actually owns the use and prevention of misuse of information as an instrument of national power. This goes back to that. The disinformation lifecycle framework would help us, in government at least, understand how we should approach the issue of dealing with large-scale character assassination, large-scale disinformation efforts. And if we take this approach, then we at least understand that we can see that at various different points we can make some progress in preventing this from happening. Now, I recognize that it is getting a little warm in here and that you guys are getting a little tired. So what I want to do now is I want to transition this from a discussion, or from me talking to you, to us having a discussion about some of these issues. Let me just set the stage by saying that, one of the things I've had an opportunity to do is work on a lot of reputation campaigns. When Edward Snowden took all of our stuff and ran off to China and then Russia, I was the director of communication for national intelligence. I took the very first call from a reporter who had, some of our information, and then we had to put in place a long-term, multi-year effort to help maintain and restore the reputation of the intelligence community, because research tells us that about 30% of you thought that we were reading your emails and listening to your phone calls. And that really meant that the intelligence community took a serious reputational hit. So that's the kind of thing that we can certainly talk about. So I want to go ahead and just stop there and see if, just from the perspective of talking with a practitioner who's dealt with some of these issues, if there are any questions. And if they're not, then I'll just keep talking. Hello? I have to move around now.
Hi, that was incredible. Thank you so much for being here. I had a question about what you were thinking about the responsibility that's kind of disproportionately put on non-males and non-white males to be held to almost a higher standard with both Rep. Omar, and then in the US, what gets constituted as a terrorist attack versus a lone person with some difficulties. And in New Zealand, they immediately said terrorist. And so I was wondering what you think about that and the power of language around those dynamics.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I actually have looked at this more recently with regard to a content analysis that looks at the language around terrorist attacks. And it's really fascinating what you see when you're talking about terrorist attacks that involve Muslim extremism. If you look at the language used in the news media, the language used in social media around Muslim extremism, the language tends to be much higher on fear, danger, outrage. The scale with regard to the words is just it's through the roof. Now, where you see much more tempered language, now to be clear, it's not to say that the language suggests that these are any less that these attacks are any less egregious. But what you see is you see language that seeks to explain or to offer some sort of explanation or some sort of rationale, some sort of reasoning behind the kinds of things that happened in Charlotte. The most fascinating was a content analysis of the language around Charlottesville. And it broke down the language that was used in conservative circles versus liberal circles, and then language that was used online. But the really interesting thing about it is that all of us, the public, tends to use language that's different if it's Muslim extremism. So I always talk about these kinds of things from the perspective that we actually have to look at ourselves and the way we talk about these things. I think that what's happening right now is we're kind of letting our leaders set the tone. If you turn on the television and people are talking about these things in ways that are different than they would if it was Muslim extremism, then we tend to talk about them that way. And I think that that's something that we have to resist the urge to do. On the issue of the kind of the different standard for people like Representative Omar, look, I think that we all see it. It's one of those things we see and we feel and we know it's there. I'm going to be very candid with you guys. I mean, when I raise issues like this, I have people who kind of look at me and say, they kind of roll their eyes and go, "Ah, there you guys go again." You kind of get that response. I think that when I get that response, the most important thing for us to do is to engage those people to understand, because it's very easy to get that response and to get upset and walk away. When I talked about Representative Omar, being called out because she was a Muslim woman who was saying something that was considered to be anti-Semitic, and I asked, some friends, I said, do you understand why people are seeing it that way? And do you understand why other people are seeing it that way? The conversation gets heated very quickly. And I think the most important thing for us to do is to recognize that, yeah, there are differences there in terms of the way people are treated and the way people are perceived. But if we can't, we have to be the kind of people that will calm the situation down and have a conversation about it. And I have been able to help some people better understand why I see things through a bit of a different lens sometimes than you are going to see those things if you're a white male. And it's not about us being different or not liking each other. It's just that we see things through a different lens sometimes. Sorry about the long-winded answer.
Thank you so much for your comments and thank you for your service. I wanted to ask you about the information warfare aspect of your comments. How would you address the lack of situational awareness among the general public with respect to that issue, particularly from state actors? And how would you address the lack of interagency coordination on the issue
Sure.
of communications?
Great, thank you for that question. A couple of different ways. Several months ago, I wrote an article a small article for USA Today, where I made the argument that with regard to the way that intelligence works right now, when you're in the intelligence community collects information, they analyze that information, and they prepare products. Those products go to customers. We refer to people like the president and agency heads as customers. It's up to those customers to decide what they're going to do with that information. So I remember under the Obama administration, when we began to see something very different happening with regard to Russia and interference in our elections. It wasn't that we had not seen that before, but we began to see something different. We began to see a level of interference that was much higher than we'd ever seen before, tactics and strategies that were different. So that information, collected, confirmed, verified, goes into a product, and it goes to leaders in the Obama administration. And in the intelligence community, what we're doing is we're kind of sitting there, we're kind of waiting. What are they going to do? What are they going to do? This is big. They've got to do something about this. Well, in the Obama administration, one of the things that was true of the Obama administration is that absolutely every decision was viewed through the lens of the law. And what that meant is that there was a long time where people were over at the White House were wringing their hands and trying to figure out what they should do. I make the argument that we need a new system with regard to disinformation. And that new system would be one in which there is a mechanism through which the intelligence community, working with the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies, can actually disperse information that goes directly to the public. And the reason I make that argument is because By the time the intelligence community sees that this little nugget over here is a disinformation campaign, let's collect more information while they're still working on it. Okay, let's get that into a product. Let's get that over to our customers. And let's wait for our customers to decide what to do with that. By the time that happens, if that information has already gotten into the information space, it's too late. It's done. And now what you have to do is now you have to go out, and if you make a decision to go to the public and say, this information is not legitimate, it's not valid information, well, it's already spread like a virus. So if we have a mechanism, a system in place in which the intelligence community can work with others to take some of that information, recognizing we've got to protect sources and methods, but if you can take some of that information directly to the public, then I think that when people see that information, there is an inoculation effect that we can probably count on with regard to that information. Yes.
Yeah, 30 years ago, Sam Keen, who's a philosopher, made a documentary called Faces of the Enemy. And the basic argument was before you kill an enemy with a weapon, you kill him with a word. And for 40 years, I've used that film in my classes to teach that words matter. In the last 2 or 3 years, these are kids who were 14, 15, 16 when we started having this climate where we have a president who blatantly will say, even though we have testimony now, I didn't say that, let alone I didn't mean that. And just recently, Ivanka Trump has done the same thing, saying he didn't mean that, even though he said these words. So my question to you is, if I was fortunate enough to bring you to my class, which I won't ask you to do, what would you tell some of these 19 or 20-year-olds? I set them through this really well-done ancient film, and of course, as you might expect, I talk at them. What would you say to them to help them grab this notion that words do matter?
So, and I think it's a really good question. It's something that everyone in the communication field is struggling with right now, because you have people who tell us what the president meant to say and what others meant to say, but it's not actually what they say. I've tried to, with my students, I've tried to take this back to a very personal level. You know, I tell my students that it's not just that words matter. Having integrity matters. I tell my students that when it comes to the things that you say and being responsible for the things that you say, you should never put yourself in a position where someone else has to tell all the rest of us what you meant to say. Anytime you're in that position, there's one thing that's true. You didn't say what you meant to say. Someone else is telling us their interpretation of what you meant to say. And that's going to make everybody view you through a different lens. I tell my students that when you watch a president and you watch people who go out and tie themselves in knots to explain what the president said, I tell my students to take a step back and ask yourself, how does it make you feel about the president? I tell my students to take a step back and ask yourself, the next time the president comes out to talk about that issue, ask yourself whether or not the president actually clarified what he meant to say. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen a lot. What I really want them to do is I want them to ask themselves whether or not they would like to be viewed through in that same light. Do you want people to look at you and say, you know, I can't trust what you say, I don't believe what you say, but you know, as long as someone else explains it to me, then you're going to be okay. You don't want to be seen in that light. Integrity matters. Have integrity. Be responsible for the things that you say. Be willing to own the things that you say, and be willing to have the courage to stand up and say, I said something, I shouldn't have said it. I said something, it wasn't right. I'll just say one other thing about that. It's really interesting being in the green room at CNN. You guys, you turn on CNN and you see these two people who are there, oftentimes one on the left and one on the right, and they're going at it on air. What you don't know is that those two people are actually in closets right across from each other on either side of the green room. And these closets have cameras in them. And so they come out after going at it on air, and they come out and they're face to face with each other. It's really interesting that, and I share this with my students because I think it helps them understand. Before you go to CNN, you're sitting there in the green room, you're sitting there with these people who may be on the left or the right, and the conversations are great. They're cordial, they're interesting, and you're getting along, and you're talking about your kid's soccer game, and everything's great. And then you go in the rooms, and the lights and cameras come on, and you're on air, and you go at each other. And I mean, you're going at each other hard. Out of the room, and you look at each other, you go, "Hey, good job. Yeah, you too." And that's it, right? So I tell my students too that you turn on the television, you see this, and it's kind of designed to work you up and to get you riled up. But the experience that I've had there, dozens and dozens of times, is that people are going out and they're doing that because that's what they think they're supposed to do. And so, don't allow this to get so deeply ingrained that you actually allow it to affect your behavior. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You're describing this discussion almost like a boxer match, right? That the sportsmen who like each other, then they are boxing, and then they are friendly again. What I'm missing in current media, especially in the United States, is that there is no referee that would help people to do the truth-checking, fact-checking. Shouldn't that be a traditional role of an anchor, of a responsible anchor, to help to be a referee in that match?
I think it's a great question, and I say this, I'm going to get in trouble with CNN for saying this. There are some shows that I really like going on, and some shows that I prefer not to go on, simply because I do think that it is the responsibility. If you have the gravitas to be able to have your own television show, one of the things that you should demand for people coming on that show is that they at least have a grasp of facts. I would never allow someone to come on my show and to blatantly lie. Now, you can come on my show and you can have different opinions. You can disagree on the issues all day long, but two things: you can't blatantly lie. Facts are facts, and you can't personally attack each other, because we're not here to launch personal attacks. We're here to talk about policy issues. We're here to debate policy issues. I agree with you. We need more of that. You know what I make my students do that they absolutely hate? It changes their lives. I'm telling you, it changes their lives. I insist that every week my students spend 1 hour watching MSNBC, 1 hour watching Fox, and 1 hour watching CNN. They must do it every week. And I tell you, they come in and they're, "Professor Turner, I can't do this. I can't watch that channel. I can't watch those people." And it's sometimes it's the guy talking about MSNBC, sometimes it's the girl talking about Fox News. But I insist that they do it, because the only way that they're going to try to find a little bit of that middle ground is by watching all of them. It's the only way. Yes.
Hi, thanks for coming. Thanks for your remarks. I think it's about framing and breaking through to the other side. And I think one side is playing chess and the other's playing checkers. I mean, after Access Hollywood tape, Donald Trump brings Bill Clinton's accusers to the last debate. I mean, with the angel moms, or at the State of the Union, I think, the other side will say, "Here's all the facts on migration. It's going to bring all these net benefits," but there might be one criminal act or two, and Trump supporters will say, "Yeah, who cares if it brings $1 million to the U.S.? One criminal act, shut it all down." Why not break through? Say, well, what would you prefer? A serial killer, or having all these benefits in one criminal, and then have them kind of think through these issues in a deeper level, make some breakthroughs other than just presenting facts and getting, the narrative changed?
No, I agree with you that it is it has become a game. And what I say about this, and this is, it's unfortunate that I think that this is what will happen to swing the pendulum back in the other direction. We have to think about, we always talk about the divisiveness and the need to come together. What was the last thing to happen in this country that brought all Americans together? 9/11. And I will tell you that, as unfortunate as it is, bringing us together as a nation, causing people who are on different ends of the political and ideological spectrum to say, "We're all in this together," it is unfortunate that it's probably going to take something horrible happening in order for people to get there. And And I think that I certainly, and certainly like all of you, don't want to ever see anything like that happen. But as we look at what all the different options are, I don't know what else there is out there. I will say that I think that with regard to the Democrats' take in the House and with regard to the election coming up, whether it's Republicans who are resurgent and take back the House and keep the White House and what have you, or it's Democrats who swing the pendulum in the other direction. The other thing that could happen is that we could actually have one side or the other, a core group of one side or the other, actually stand up and be responsible and act like adults and govern and do the things that they need to do in order to bring us together. I do think that that's my optimistic view, is that there's a group out there that's going to do that. But it brought us the Iraq War. It brought us a lot of other things that over time. It brought us the 2001 AUMF, which is one of my pet peeves. It brought us a lot of things that brought us together in ways that were good, but also some things that brought us together in ways that were not so good. And I fully acknowledge that. Yeah.
You were talking about forming a system that allows for information not to be misinterpreted, factured. Why hasn't the United States created something like journalist integrity, where you have license like lawyers have license, and that they can't break that certain standards in order for journalism to work? Because a lot of times what happens in America is like you have these commentators that really are not really like putting information out. They're not bringing in the news. You're living here, you don't know what's going on outside.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll tell you in a couple very direct points. One, there's absolutely, and I've talked to journalists. I talk with journalists every day. There's absolutely no scenario in which journalists would ever want a system that actually identifies who qualifies as a journalist and who doesn't qualify as a journalist. The fact of the matter is that if you look at journalism, if you look at the definition of journalism, if I am, that guy that the president talked about, being at home, sitting in my basement, and I got a blog and I'm reaching, 15,000 people with my blog, then for the journalism field, it's good that qualifies as journalism, because they don't want it to be limited, because as soon as you start limiting what journalism is, then you begin to put standards and guidelines in place that actually allow for people to be held accountable. One of the things I really struggled with in the intelligence community was that when Glenn Greenwald, I used to talk with Glenn Greenwald on the phone about the next tranche of intelligence documents. When he started The Intercept, now here you have a guy who is in possession, in my view, who is a criminal, because he is in possession of reams of classified U.S. government documents about programs that are still active programs. He starts The Intercept, and suddenly he's a journalist. And he's no different than the New York Times or the Washington Post, who, by the way, are also publishing classified documents. So now they're the same. So if you go after Glenn Greenwald was smart. He said, Washington Post is publishing those documents, and the government's not going after them because it's a journalist outfit. I'm going to start one. Now, he feels like he's got that umbrella of security. I will say there are a couple of things that are going on, and then I'll finish up here. A couple of things that are going on that are encouraging with regard to this. One, I really like what PolitiFact is doing with Facebook. They have a situation where PolitiFact actually, it's kind of like a good housekeeping seal of approval. When you see something on Facebook, PolitiFact will often have checked that information ahead of time, given it its stamp of, yes, this is valid, this is factual information, and people are starting to pay attention to that as they go through. And what they're finding is that people are actually clicking on that information more frequently than they're clicking on information that don't have that good housekeeping seal of approval. So I think that's a very encouraging thing. And I also think, as with everything, the fact that we're having conversations like this and discussing this topic also is very, very positive in terms of developing solutions. So I got to get out of here. Thank you all very much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was a great discussion. Thank you.
Shawn. Thank you. Right, we have a 5 minutes break before we switch to another panel. So we'll be able to make it.
Oh, yeah, I'll be fine.
So there is one man from Greece. He just had a quick question.
Oh, sure.